Good evening. I have an interesting question for you guys. How big does Bigfoot get? Or do Bigfoots get? Well, it'd be really easy to say something between 2 and 3 feet tall when they're born to 8 to 10 feet tall, but when you really start looking at this, you realize, like everything, there's a little bit of nuance to it. Because when you talk about how big Bigfoot gets, you got to realize that we've talked about on this channel. Some of the new people may not be so familiar with this, but the people who've been around know there are many different types of Bigfoot. We'll just stick with the type 1s, the patty types, the big omnivorous types, and the type 2s, the wood boogers. Those seem to be the most common. So with the type 1s and 2 being the overwhelming majority, yes, there are gugwees, yes, there are the more relic hominid looking types, yes, there are wendigos, but those seem to be pretty rare. If you're talking like East Texas and the Pacific Northwest, East Texas being mostly type 2s with some type 1s, and mostly exclusively the type 1 big patty type Bigfoots being in the Pacific Northwest. So we'll take a look at those. The one thing you got to understand, if we assume that they're all pretty close to the same species or pretty close to the same genus, maybe as similar as black bears and grizzly bears are, that there's something called Bergmann's rule, which is the farther north you go, the colder the climate, the bigger animals get, and the farther south you go, the smaller animals get. Now, this is represented in the best thing that I've always compared Bigfoots to is bears. In the Arctic area, you have giant polar bears, and then you have grizzly bears, and then you have, black bears going on down, and you have a lot of inner areas where these bears cross over, but then you get down to sloth bears and a lot of the smaller bears when you get down into South America. So I think that's what we really have to consider here as well. So the other thing I was thinking about is it's pretty common knowledge, but people don't often think about it. If you take a 6 foot tall human that weighs 200 pounds, pretty average size for an American male, and you double their height to 12 feet tall, they're not going to weigh 400 pounds. They're going to weigh closer to like 1,000 pounds, maybe more. Just because you double the height of something, everything else grows in proportion. So when it comes to estimating Bigfoot weight, it's really, really hard. I don't know the weight. You could, 1,500 pounds. I guess you guess polar bear size. If you could stand a polar bear, I guess that would be pretty good. That would be a pretty good analogous to it. Height, though, we can gauge off of trees and tree branches and backgrounds and scaling. Weight is something else. If somebody wants to take a Bigfoot and lure them onto a truck scale with food or bait of some kind, that would be awesome. But it's not something I'm going to volunteer for. So the weight aside, we can go by height. And believe it or not, in the fossil record, I'm sure most of you know, there's Gigantopithecus blacki. A lot of debate whether this was a quadruped like a gorilla or a biped like a human or like Sasquatch. It's probably a quadruped, but if it stood straight up, it would be about 3 meters, or right around 12 feet. That's huge, and I think that's a good context to show that and the world was much colder back then in different climates, so I think that's a pretty good representation. You see a lot of these pictures floating around on the internet. I love these. They're a great illustration. But in this picture here, 7.5 foot tall, that's about as big as Patty was from the Patterson-Gimlin film. And she was very smallish. She was a female, smaller specimen, just like you could have like my wife, who's 5'10", or her sister, who's 5'4". There's just a lot of variance, and I think that's probably why Patty was considered pretty much shorter. And when it comes down to the type 1s on the left and the type 2s on the right, the type 1s are definitely, I think, a little more intelligent. They're a little bigger. They're probably more akin to what you would think like a grizzly bear. And I think the type 2s on the right, I think, are a little bit more like a black bear. And you could still get huge black bears. You can get 500-pound black bears. But you can get, 1,000-pound grizzly bears and 1,500-pound polar bears. This is a pretty good experiment I came across here. You got Vern Troyer, you got some girl, and you got a football player. The football player is about average at 6 foot with shoulder pads. And then you look at a 9-foot Sasquatch, which would be considered middle of the road. And when you scale up the shoulders, I think that's what most people don't comprehend about these things until they've seen one or really talked to people is exactly how big they get. I love this picture, which is why we're going to end with it. So if someone tells you they had a Sasquatch encounter, or they heard of one being 10, 11, 12, 14 feet tall, don't doubt them. 14 feet tall, I think, is on the outer edge of where they can get, but I would not be surprised. If it gets over, say, 14 feet tall, say 15, 16, 17 feet tall, then I think you're starting to talk about something else, which we've talked about in other videos, and that's a mountain giant. We're not going to get into them right now because that's a whole different customer. But yeah, if people tell you they've seen a 12-foot tall Bigfoot, don't doubt them. Anyways, have a pleasant evening. Please hit the thumbs up button. Please ring the bell for notifications. Thank you.